Get out of here, temp worker. Useless dude in his 40s. Tommy and Anderson sneered as they spat out those words. On those words, my chest filled with humiliation, anger, and a swirling sense of helplessness. The meeting room fell completely silent, like the calm after a storm. The unbearable humiliation tightened around my chest, but even so, I made up my mind and spoke up. I'm quitting. Quitting. Go ahead. Losing one temp worker won't bother this company in the slightest. Honestly, it's a relief. If Wilson quits, the number of mistakes in our department will finally go down. I even lost the will to respond and quietly started walking toward the door of the meeting room. But that's when it happened. Hey, what's going on here? A low voice sliced through the tense air of the room. I turned around to see our CEO, Tom Williams, standing in the doorway. My name is Sam Wilson. I'm 42 years old. 12 years ago, my wife passed away right after giving birth to our son, Kevin, and my life completely derailed. The overwhelming grief of losing the woman I loved and the harsh reality of becoming a first-time father immediately consumed me. The man I once was steadily climbing the career ladder at a major corporation was gone. When I returned to work after bereavement leave, my colleagues were all supportive at first. But over time, they became disappointed in the useless shell of a man I had become. That's the reality of corporate life. If you can't perform, you're discarded. Eventually, the stress took its toll on my health. I took a leave of absence and, after some time, resigned without ever returning. From that point on, my life revolved solely around raising my son, filled with a bitter awareness of my own inadequacy. Thankfully, I had my parents and in-laws to support me. Without their help, I'm certain I would have completely broken down. It took time, but as I watched my son grow, I slowly began to recover. 10 years ago, I finally decided to resume working. However, the ambition to reach for lofty career goals had vanished. More than anything, I wanted to prioritize my time with my son. That's why I chose to work as a contract employee rather than pursuing a full-time position. My salary was less than half of what it used to be, but I didn't care. By giving up stability, I felt I could find small joys in my family life. And so, I began working in the sales department of Williams Foods, a mid-sized food manufacturer, as a contract employee. 10 years passed in this role, filled with minor tasks and a routine of commuting between home and work. As long as my son was happy and smiling, that was enough for me. But recently, I've found myself wondering, is this really okay? This way of life I chose was meant to protect my son. I thought I could take pride in it. But ever since I gave up on becoming a full-time employee, I've had lingering feelings of unease. The corporate world is ruthless and cruel. Those without skills are cast aside, and if you don't speak up, your very existence is ignored. Yet, I've willingly stayed in the shadows, using my son as an excuse. I had no idea that a fateful day was approaching. Tommy McDonald joined our sales department at the start of the year, dressed in a sharp black suit with a cold, expressionless face. His piercing gaze froze the entire department in an instant. I later learned that Tommy was an elite graduate of an Ivy League in his early 40s and had become a department head in his 30s. I'm Tommy, and starting today, I'll be the head of the sales department. His voice was low and commanding, filled with an air of intimidation. Even though it was supposed to be a formal greeting, we all felt as if he had declared his dominance over us. After narrowing his eyes and scanning the room, he placed some documents on the desk and sat down. Every single one of his movements seemed calculated, leaving no room for error. Now, first, I'd like to get a sense of the current state of the sales department." Tommy said this matter-of-factly as he began operating the tablet he had brought. Occasionally, he would call out the names of employees and ask them brief questions. It appeared he was reviewing some personnel data. A sense of foreboding grew in my chest. Before long, his gaze stopped, and his eyebrows twitched ever so slightly. It didn't take long to realize that Tommy was staring at my page. "Wilson." "Yes, that's me. Sam Wilson, in your 40s, contract employee, graduated from a local university." He deliberately read out my details. There was a trace of contempt in his voice. "Well, 10 years as a contract employee. Seems like you've been pretty comfortable staying in the same position for so long." That comment, delivered with a slight smirk, made the air in the room grow even heavier. I could hear the small shuffle of a young employee sitting next to me, but no one dared to speak. I clenched my fists but couldn't find the words to argue back. My heartbeat sped up, and a cold sweat trickled down my back. Well, being a contract employee means you don't have to take responsibility, so it's probably pretty easygoing. Tommy kept his eyes fixed on me as he continued. His tone was cold, and his disdain for me was clear. The sales floor was wrapped in silence. Not a single person attempted to break the oppressive atmosphere. No, perhaps it was more accurate to say that no one could. Tommy's overwhelming presence had swallowed everyone whole. Anyway, let's get started with today's meeting. Tommy finally averted his gaze from me and casually began listing the agenda items. A few weeks after Tommy joined the sales department, a new employee named Hannah Anderson approached my desk. Anderson, dressed in a crisp white blouse and a pencil skirt, carried herself with a polished air. She was a standout presence in the office and often displayed behavior that seemed aimed at currying favor with Tommy. "Mr. Wilson, could you take care of this for me?" She placed a thick stack of documents on my desk. The papers were filled with unfamiliar figures and graphs. It was clearly not part of my responsibilities. "Isn't this your assignment?" "Well, it is, but I'm a bit swamped right now, and this is kind of urgent. Besides, you're good at these kinds of things, right?" The phrase "you're good at these kinds of things" stuck oddly in my mind. She was undoubtedly referring to the behind-the-scenes tasks I often handled as a contract employee. Yet, there wasn't the slightest hint of malice in her expression. If anything, she seemed to be smiling slightly. That obliviousness made it all the more infuriating. "Even if it's urgent, it's not due today or tomorrow, is it? Why don't you try handling it yourself a bit more?" "But I really don't want to mess this up. I can't afford to disappoint Manager Tommy." The moment Tommy's name came up, an unpleasant feeling stirred inside me. Rumors had been going around that Anderson was willing to do anything to catch Tommy's attention, and now I was sure they were true. She was planning to use me to boost her own evaluation. "Sorry, but I've got a pile of work myself." "Come on, Wilson, don't be like that. Contract employees are supposed to be flexible, right? Supporting full-time staff is literally your job, isn't it?" "Fine." In the end, I sighed and accepted the documents. I didn't believe refusing would change anything, and I didn't want to waste any more time. But that was a mistake. The following week, during the sales meeting, Tommy said, "Anderson, that report you prepared was excellent. You really went above and beyond on your own." For a moment, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Holding the report I had completed, he was praising Anderson. Apparently, she hadn't told him she had dumped the work on me. "Thank you. It was all thanks to your guidance, Manager Tommy." In that instant, something inside me felt like it snapped. Am I destined to remain nothing more than a tool to be used? That day, Like every other, I arrived at my desk first thing in the morning and began tackling my mountain of work. Though my tasks were endless, what weighed on me most wasn't the workload, it was the presence of Tommy and Anderson. Tommy, as always, remained cold, as if I didn't even exist. No, it was more than that. He saw me as nothing more than a broken tool. He systematically excluded me from important projects and dumped tasks outside my responsibilities onto me. And of course, not once did he offer a word of thanks. Then there was Anderson. Not only did she pass her own work onto me, but she also presented it as if it were her own achievement. The presentation materials I prepared, she handed them to Tommy and claimed all the credit. Worse still, she even pinned her mistakes on me. But when it came to speaking up about it in front of Tommy, I was powerless. Then, during one particular meeting, something happened. "All right, it's almost time for the meeting. Everyone, please head to the conference room." I reviewed my notes and headed to the meeting room, where around 15 of us were scheduled to discuss future strategies for the sales department. However, as others began to take their seats, I noticed something strange. There was no seat for me. What? I looked around the room, but my name wasn't on any of the nameplates, and there was no chair for me. "What's wrong, Wilson?" I turned to see Anderson standing behind me, smirking faintly. Behind her was Tommy, standing with his arms crossed and an unmistakable expression of mockery on his face. The meeting room setup was supposed to be Anderson's responsibility as a new hire. And, of course, it went without saying that Tommy had given her those instructions. Contract employees don't need chairs. Tommy's cold words were directed at me as I stood there, bewildered. For a moment, the other employees' faces tensed in discomfort. "Manager Tommy, isn't that a bit?" someone murmured softly, trying to object. But Tommy waved it off dismissively. "There's no need to force someone out of place to participate. Contract employees should stick to behind-the-scenes work where they belong." Honestly, even if Wilson stayed, I doubt he'd understand the meeting's content. I was at a loss for words. But Tommy and Anderson weren't done yet. "Get out of here, temp worker." Useless dude in his 40s. In that moment, humiliation, anger, and a crushing sense of powerlessness swirled inside me. The meeting room fell as silent as a grave. The unbearable weight of humiliation pressed down on my chest, but even so, I gathered my courage and opened my mouth to speak. "I quit." The meeting room erupted into murmurs. But Tommy and Anderson didn't seem fazed at all. Anderson even burst into laughter. "Quit, go ahead." Tommy scoffed as he spoke. "It's not like losing one contract employee is going to cause this company any problems. If anything, it's a relief. Maybe the number of mistakes in our department will go down if Wilson leaves." I didn't even have the strength to respond to their words. Quietly, I turned and began walking toward the door. But that was when it happened. "Hey, what's going on here?" A low voice cut through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. When I turned around, I saw the CEO, Tom Williams, standing in the doorway of the meeting room. That day was unusual, as CEO, Williams was scheduled to attend our meeting. That must have been why Tommy conspired with Anderson to push me out. Arriving earlier than expected, Williams' expression was tense. "CEO, Williams, thank you for joining us," Tommy said, hurriedly straightening his posture. But his movements betrayed a hint of unease. "What's going on here? I thought I just heard Wilson say he's quitting." Williams' gaze swept across Tommy, Anderson, and finally rested on me. "I'll explain." Anderson was the first to raise her voice. Almost gleefully, as though she had been handed an opportunity. "Actually, Wilson just suddenly announced his resignation. We don't know why, but he's been complaining about his work for a while now. It's probably due to a lack of responsibility. That's right. Tommy chimed in, his tone filled with feigned sincerity. As a contract employee, it's understandable that he struggles to maintain a sense of responsibility. We've tried to support him as much as we could, but it seems we've reached the limit. As Williams listened to their explanation, his face gradually paled. He turned his eyes toward me, but there was no accusation in them. If anything, he looked distressed and confused. Is that true, Wilson? I hesitated, feeling a twinge of guilt, but eventually nodded silently. Yes, I can't find any reason to continue working here. I've reached my limit. William's eyes widened at my words. Then, to my astonishment, he bowed deeply. Please, Wilson, don't quit. We can't afford to lose you. The meeting room buzzed with murmurs of shock. Even I was stunned, but Tommy and Anderson were visibly more shaken than anyone else. Sir, what's going on? Why are you bowing to a contract employee? Their panicked voices went unanswered as Williams didn't even glance their way. Wilson, we really need you. The company genuinely needs you. His voice was clear and earnest. Looking at the bewildered and flustered faces of Tommy and Anderson, I felt a small sense of vindication in my chest. I didn't know what the future of this company held, but one thing was clear. They could no longer lord over everyone as they had before. Unable to contain himself any longer, Tommy asked Williams, CEO, Williams, why are you so intent on keeping a contract employee like Wilson? Anderson quickly chimed in. Exactly. There are plenty of replacements for someone like Wilson. Tommy, Anderson, enough. You clearly didn't know, but Wilson is an incredibly important asset to this company. As Williams continued, Tommy and Anderson's faces showed disbelief. As you both know, our sales division also handles marketing and logistics management to cut costs. Now, what do you think makes that possible? It's because of the system that integrates marketing, sales, and logistics processes. Exactly. And the very person who created that system is this Wilson. In the next instant, the smug expressions disappeared from Tommy and Anderson's faces, replaced by an ashen pallor. Seeing their reaction, a small sense of triumph rose within me. Without the integrated system Wilson created, our sales division wouldn't function. Without him, this company would descend into chaos. There's no replacement for Wilson. After a moment of silence, Tommy finally spoke. Sir, but isn't that a bit of an overstatement? The system may be excellent, but couldn't someone else take over? It's irreplaceable. The CEO interrupted coldly. There was a weight to his words that left no room for argument. The system Wilson developed is a culmination of his experience and knowledge as a former systems engineer. Finding someone to replace him would require an enormous amount of time and money. Even if we did find a replacement, maintaining the current level of performance would be nearly impossible. Tommy's face visibly changed. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Beside him, Anderson was similarly shaken. It was no surprise, really. The only person who knew about my background as a systems engineer for a major corporation was CEO Williams. I had given up on returning to engineering due to the gap in my career. But I began writing simple programs on my own to improve the efficiency of my work at Williams Foods. When the CEO saw this, he was so impressed that he implemented my system across the entire company. Wilson's contributions are immeasurable. I've repeatedly tried to persuade him to join as a full-time employee, but he always turned me down. Ridiculous. Why would anyone turn down a full-time position? I declined because I wanted to prioritize time with my son. For me, that was the most important thing. You're telling me he wasn't just a normal contract employee? Finally, the two of them were at a loss for words. They had looked down on me for being a contract employee, only to find out that I was a critical asset to the company. This truth was enough to shatter their arrogance. The tension in the meeting room remained palpable. As the CEO fixed Tommy and Anderson with a stern glare, I took a deep breath and spoke up. CEO Williams, I'd like to say something about manager Tommy and Anderson. Tommy and Anderson averted their eyes for a moment, but there was nowhere for them to hide now. I'd like to talk about the unfair treatment I've received from those two. Tommy hurriedly tried to interject. Wait a minute, that's just your perspective. You can't make accusations like that. It's not just my perspective. I have evidence, I said calmly. I reached into my bag and pulled out a USB stick. Here are the complied records of yours. For example, emails and memos showing how the manager forced unpaid overtime on me. Evidence of Anderson blaming her mistakes on me. And even audio recordings of the two of them insulting me. All eyes in the room turned to the USB. Tommy's face turned pale, and Anderson bit her lip. This USB contains irrefutable evidence. If necessary, I'm prepared to submit it to the Labor Standards Office. Tommy, his face contorted with anger, raised his voice. That could be fabricated. How can anyone trust it? Would you like to check it here? I can play the files on the conference room PC. Tommy was visibly shaken and fell silent. The CEO spoke quietly. Wilson, is this true? Yes, it is. I've worked diligently for the past 10 years, but after being treated this way, I couldn't stay silent. It may not be the most commendable approach, but I had no choice but to keep records to protect myself. The CEO nodded deeply and turned his gaze to Tommy and Anderson. Well, both of you, explain yourselves. Tommy started to open his mouth but couldn't say a word. Anderson, too, lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. Manager Tommy, Anderson, your behavior is nothing more than childish harassment. You've used the company's hierarchy to crush someone in a weaker position. As a result, morale on the ground has plummeted, and the company's overall profitability has suffered. The CEO nodded grimly and turned his gaze toward Tommy. Tommy, if this is true, the responsibility lies squarely with you. As someone in a managerial position, there's no excuse for allowing this situation to occur. Tommy slumped his shoulders and remained silent. Anderson, the same applies to you, even if you didn't know Wilson's true value. Belittling someone just because they're a contract employee is wrong. When the CEO addressed her, Anderson's voice trembled as she tried to speak, her eyes welling up with tears. But even at this moment, her attempt to curry favor with him was transparent. I'm sorry, sir, but I wasn't the only one at fault. I've heard enough excuses. The CEO cut her off decisively, unwilling to hear more. I stopped in my tracks as I was about to leave the meeting room and turned around. There was still something I needed to say. CEO Williams, I have one last thing I'd like to address. My voice carried weight, and the CEO, visibly tired, looked at me with a resigned expression. But his attentive posture showed he was still willing to listen. For the 10 years I've worked here, I've always felt that these issues persist because the upper management turns a blind eye to them. The CEO's face tightened slightly. I've often wondered how someone like Manager Tommy was able to rise through the ranks without any trouble. After investigating, I learned that he had harassed certain employees in his previous department as well. Senior management must have been aware of this. Yet, instead of resolving the issue, the company merely transferred him to another department. Tommy's face turned even paler. He averted his gaze, biting his lip. It's not just about Tommy. The same applies to Anderson. Everyone in the company knows she is the daughter of one of the executives. During her new employee training, she received special treatment even before joining the sales department. No matter how much effort her peers put in, she alone was favored. Did you realize how much that undermined morale among the other employees? Anderson kept her head down, motionless. The heavy atmosphere in the meeting room was suffocating as no one could offer any defense. When problematic employees are not only left unpunished but actively favored, while the victims are silenced, it's no surprise that talented people leave the company. The CEO let out a deep sigh and sank into his chair as if the weight of the situation had physically pressed down on him. Wilson, what you're saying is absolutely right. I can't deny my responsibility as the CEO for letting this situation continue unchecked. Hearing his words didn't bring me much solace. No matter how remorseful the CEO sounded, it wouldn't bring back the lost time or restore my wounded self-esteem. I just wanted to do my job here. I hoped to contribute to the company while protecting the time I had with my son. But even that wasn't possible. The CEO closed his eyes and nodded deeply. When he opened them again and looked at Tommy and Anderson, there was unmistakable anger in his gaze. After a brief pause, I spoke calmly once more. If this company truly wants to change, it needs to start respecting the voices of its employees. Otherwise, this will happen again. The CEO remained silent for a while but eventually nodded firmly. They'll take your words to heart. Losing you is a significant blow to the company, but more importantly, we must learn from this incident. I glanced at him and walked toward the door once more. This time, I didn't look back, but I heard the CEO's faint voice behind me. Wilson, I'm sorry. Without responding, I left the meeting room. A few months after I left Williams Foods, I heard rumors that the company was in turmoil. Apparently, the integrated system had completely stopped functioning. Sales management and logistics optimization in the sales division were disrupted, and the e-commerce division faced massive shipping delays. No one had truly understood the underlying mechanisms that had supported their efficiency. Additionally, the documents I submitted to the Labor Standards Office caused a major stir. Other employees who had suffered under similar circumstances began to come forward one after another, exposing Tommy and Anderson's misconduct as a serious problem for the entire company. Their cruel actions and the extent of the harm they caused came to light. In the end, Tommy was dismissed for disciplinary reasons, and Anderson was forced to resign. But that wasn't the end of it. Williams Foods, now struggling with poor performance, had no choice but to lay off hundreds of its employees. The company, which had been passed down through 3 generations, was forced to drastically downsize. I didn't know who the CEO held responsible for it all. But one thing is clear. My departure exposed just how fragile their foundation had always been. Even imagining the suffering of those who looked down on me doesn't stir any sympathy. Their miserable fate is the result of their own choices. I'm home. As I opened the front door, Kevin came running to me with a big smile. Welcome back, Dad. I made curry today. I'm not sure if it's done well, but let's eat together. Hearing his innocent voice brought a natural smile to my face. Kevin, who will be starting middle school soon, has been helping out around the house more than ever. Recently, he often cooks dinner and waits for me to come home. After leaving Williams Foods, I started working as a full-time engineer at a new company. The pay is better, and the work environment has improved significantly. I owe this to Kevin's suggestion. Dad, I want you to do work that makes you happy. His pure words struck a deep chord in my heart. That's why I decided to challenge myself again. At my new workplace, I feel that my past experiences are being put to good use. More than anything, I'm thrilled that my work is being recognized and valued. But what makes me happiest is knowing that Kevin's smile will always be waiting for me when I come home. When I took a bite of the curry, the faint aroma of spices filled my mouth. This is really good. Kevin smiled, a little embarrassed but also proud. As I looked at him, I felt the depth of his growth and reflected on everything that had happened. The separation from my wife, the humiliating days at that company, and the long journey to reclaim myself. And now, I'm wrapped in this small happiness. There will surely be more challenges and hardships ahead. Even so, we'll keep moving forward to protect what's most important to me and to build a new future together with my son.